back for another weekly Q&A here, and the first question comes from Pedro. I hope I didn't totally butcher that, but he mentioned that basically he's going to be a doctor and he's going through school, doesn't have a lot of time right now, but doesn't want to just be the average guy that trains 3 days a week for an hour. What should he do? And, I totally get where you're coming from. Like, I think that for a lot of us, we want to pursue like an above average physique and just an above average kind of lifestyle to where we're looking pretty good, we're healthy, that sort of thing. And the average person, like, I don't know if this is going to sound harsh, but they're not in very great shape or very great health. And I totally understand where you're coming at. And I would say that it's about priorities and, being very busy as a doctor and spending a lot of time with your work. If that's your priority, that's automatically going to put training at less of a priority. And if you have a family that's a priority on top of that and other things going on in your life that are priorities above that, then you have less and less time for training. Now, there's things that you can do to get in a more effective stimulus in less time. So, antagonistic supersets, drop sets, myo reps, all of that stuff can be very beneficial. And if you only had like 5 hours to train each week, you could use those techniques and get in a very effective stimulus. And I think that's something that I need to do here with Revive Stronger's team up, make some templates of what someone can do with 5 or 6 hours or less, or 3 days a week or something like that. But antagonistic supersets can help out. I think that's something that, especially for people with busier schedules, training first thing in the morning, I think is very helpful because, at the end of a workday, long workday, you're kind of emotionally just tired. And that usually makes training a little bit more difficult. Now, some people kind of use that as a good thing. And it's like, hey, I'm emotionally tired now. I need to go train to get my energy up. That can be a good way to think about things. But in your situation, I would very well likely, I would probably be a weekend warrior to where I have 2 longer sessions maybe on the weekend, and then maybe just 2 days during the week, you train in the morning and you get like an upper lower. You could get a Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, upper lower. And if you could carve out maybe an hour and a half on the weekends and then an hour during the week, you could still get a very effective stimulus in. I would make sure to prioritize muscles that you want to grow the most. Like, in my situation, I don't care about my legs as much, and I would, in that sort of situation, I would definitely put my legs on the back burner because I know I have less time and really focus on the muscle groups that I care most about. So by prioritizing muscle groups, by using antagonistic supersets, drop sets, myo reps, by training first things in the morning, those are all things that you can do that might help you out with that. And making sure to schedule in your training, making it a priority, and making sure to take that time for yourself, I think that you can still do a good job. And that doesn't mean that you just have to accept having kind of an average physique and training just a few hours a week. And hey, I also don't think that there's anything wrong with that. Like, if someone wants to just look more kind of normal and train a few hours a week just to be healthy, like, I think that's awesome too. And there's a lot of cool things in life, but I think that if you're watching this, you probably want to pursue a good looking physique. So that's what would be on my mind. I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions. All right. Second question. When I'm training at home, what should my calories be? So my recommendation has been, I don't think it's a good idea at this point to push an assertive surplus, nor do I think it's a good idea to aggressively go through a fat loss phase. But if it's just for a couple of weeks, I think that you're still probably pretty fine in a moderate calorie deficit, like 500 calories per day or less. And even if you're in a slight surplus, like you can get effective workouts in at home. And Revive Stronger just released free templates that you can go use. They're great. Or you could ask me how your program looks. Like, I'll help you out. But in those situations, you can still get an effective stimulus. I just don't think it's a good time to be on either end of the spectrum of pushing a fat loss phase real hard or being in an assertive surplus. Now, I think that as long as you are still doing some sort of workouts at home to where you're getting in some sort of effective stimulus per muscle per week, that you could still be in a moderate deficit or maybe even in a slight surplus. I wouldn't go crazy with it at this point, and I think that for a lot of people, maintaining might be the best option here, especially if people are more stressed out or some people can't even go to the grocery store and get their protein. So in those situations, maintain, but hopefully it's just a few weeks here. And, anything that's just a few weeks long isn't probably going to be a big deal in the grand scheme of things. So that's what my general advice is. Avoid the extremes and you should be good as long as you are still providing that stimulus to your muscles somewhat. But in a lot of situations, just maintaining is probably a decent route here, all right? Third question, is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy a myth? And I would say this is something that it was like several years ago, people were like, okay, you have to train for sarcoplasmic and myofibrillar hypertrophy. And then a few years later, it was like, no, it's just myofibrillar. Sarcoplasmic doesn't exist. And now it's like, what's going on here? So no, I do not think it's a myth. There's research by Dr. Cody Hahn that suggests, so I would go look up studies by Dr. Cody Hahn is his name. And one of the studies they did, I believe it was a 6-week training program. I'm trying to just do this off the top of my head here, so some of this could be a little off, but I believe it was 6 weeks, and for the initial few weeks, they actually saw a decrease in myofibrillar protein content, so of the actual myofibril, the actin and myosin actually decreased the myofibrillar components, but they saw an increase in their muscle size, which may suggest that, at least initially, that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy made up a big portion of that growth. And they were specifically they worked from 10 sets to 32 sets to failure. And if you looked at their program, this shit was real. So that does suggest, I think, that, hey, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, there's other components rather than the myofibrils that grow. And should you be training for one or the other and periodizing that? That is a tricky question. I think that in general, it's probably a good idea to have periods of higher and lower volumes and to make sure that you're incorporating a variety of rep ranges and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I still have a very hard time seeing that if someone asked me, hey, over the next 5 years, you're going to do a program to where you do 3 mesocycles of high volume hypertrophy style training, followed by 1 mesocycle of more strength, lower volume training, and repeat that compared to just doing high volumes all the time. And if you ask me in 5 years, will there be a significant difference between the two? I actually have a hard time thinking that there's going to be that big of a difference between the two. So for the average person trying to put on a lot of muscle, I don't think that it's going to be a big deal. Now, I could be wrong. I'm definitely open to being wrong, and I will continue to look at evidence that refutes that, but I have a hard time seeing it being that big of a difference. And, like I said, that doesn't mean there couldn't be any difference. And maybe for the advanced bodybuilder doing something like that, maybe it's a good idea, but it's so hard to say right now. And I think that in general, working in a variety of rep ranges, having within your macro cycle, maybe having at least one phase of lower volumes and heavier type work, probably a good idea. And if you're doing that, I think that you're pretty well set up, all right? So not a myth, but the harder question is, can you specifically train for it and train for the different types of hypertrophy? Hard to say, all right? Next question. What do you think about doing isolations before compound lifts? So I think that it's probably fine in a lot of situations. And for some people, it can help improve kind of the mind muscle connection on the compound lifts and stuff like that. But I would be careful with it. I think that it makes a lot of sense to do those bigger lifts when you're most fresh. And I say that because those lifts are probably a bit more kind of technically challenging. So more of a skill to do a squat or something like that. And the more fatigued you are, the more difficult I think it's going to be to perform really well on those lifts. And another consideration is if our muscle fibers that grow the most are our kind of faster twitch muscle fibers, and if those have any preferential growth to heavier loads and more lower to moderate rep ranges, so 5 to 10 rep ranges with compound lifts with heavier loads, if that's true, then one might say, hey, training those lifts when you're fresh might be a good idea. And one way to look at it is like, how much does my squats suffer after doing a leg extension beforehand? I would say at least a moderate degree. Like squatting doesn't usually feel great after doing an isolation lift before. Sometimes some people like it, but my performance on squats is always quite a bit worse if I did like a leg extension before. But then when I flip that and I look at how much worse are my leg extensions after squats, and really, if I'm in, especially if I'm in like the 12 to 20 rep range, a higher rep range, not much. Like I usually am able to still have a similar performance versus flipping those around. So I think that for kind of those reasons, it makes sense for most of the time to have compounds kind of lead the way there when you're fresh. Now, I think that there's also an argument that, hey, maybe performing those isolations first and stressing your muscle in that direct kind of angle when it's fresh might actually provide a little bit of additional growth because you've never hit that muscle in that angle when it's fresh. So if you've never done leg extensions first before a squat pattern, maybe training your quads at peak extension like that when you're fresh right away, maybe that could actually lead to some extra growth because it's kind of a novel stimulus there and you haven't really done it. That's an interesting theory. So I think that the majority of the time, I would still lead with compounds when you're fresh. But maybe 1/3 of the time or 1/4 of the time, mixing it up and playing with some isolations before compounds isn't a bad idea. And so an example of what my leg training might look like is I train my quads 3 days a week. And day 1, I might start with a squat pattern. Day 2, all I do for my quads is leg extensions because I treat it as a lighter day, kind of get blood flow in there, but still a little bit of a stimulus. And if I'm only doing leg extensions, of course, I start with those. And then on that 3rd day, I might come back to leading with a compound exercise. So if I'm training them 3 days a week, I might make sure that 2 of them, hey, maybe we lead with that compound. But then after that, I don't see a problem with playing around with those isolations first. All right. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. And the final question. So my best friend actually asked me this over on Instagram. And he's like, hey, man, what do you think for the ladies? Do they prefer biceps or abs more? And I actually thought about this for way too long. And I think, of course, I don't like go around asking girls this. So I really have no idea. But I would say biceps. And the reason I say that is because I feel like girls are kind of more accepting of having a little bit of a tummy and having kind of a dad bod and not having everything in shape. And I think that some girls even view the guy that's really ripped as, okay, yeah, he might be good looking, but he might just be like really high maintenance and really narcissistic and stuff like that. And I know that's not true for it. Like a lot of the people that I meet in bodybuilding that are like yoked are some of the nicest guys I know. So I think that that's a stereotype that isn't always true. For some people it is true, but not always. But I think that might actually make them not want to, well, maybe not want to have a relationship with you. I don't know. I don't really know. I would say maybe biceps. That's what I've been working on. I work on my abs too. All right, I'm done now. See you guys.